In the earliest days of portable gaming, when screens glowed green and pixels told stories through limitation, the first Pokémon games held secrets that would take decades to fully uncover. Hidden beneath the surface of red, blue, and yellow lay exploits, glitches, and programming quirks that transformed simple adventures into laboratories of possibility. Before we drift any further, maybe tap subscribe for more calming videos, and tell me where you're joining from tonight. And the first of these secrets involves a creature that should never have existed at such power, obtained through a sequence so specific that discovering it felt like archaeology. The level 100 Nidoking exploit in Pokémon Yellow remains one of the most elaborate early game manipulations ever documented in the original games. The process begins in Viridian Forest, that quiet maze of trees and trainers where most players caught their first Caterpie or Weedle without thinking twice. Deep within the forest stands a bug catcher facing sideways, his line of sight programmed to trigger the moment players enter his visual range. The exploit requires walking precisely into his field of view while simultaneously opening the start menu, a timing so exact that it forces the game into a confused state where it believes a battle should begin but cannot properly execute the encounter. Using an escape rope from this locked menu state sends the player back to the Pokémon Center, but the game's internal memory retains fragments of the interrupted battle, creating what speedrunners call a deferred encounter that waits dormant until specific conditions reactivate it. The next step requires returning to Viridian Forest and encountering a level 4 Caterpie in the tall grass. This Caterpie serves as a catalyst for the exploit, its internal data values about to be manipulated in ways the developers never anticipated. Lowering its attack stat 6 stages using Pikachu's growl becomes essential, as these stat modifications write specific values into memory addresses that the game will reference later. After making the Caterpie faint, the player must travel toward Mount Moon on Route 3 and speak to an NPC who offers to escort them back to Pewter City's gym. This NPC interaction triggers a series of memory checks that, when combined with the deferred encounter from the bug catcher, creates an unstable game state that resolves in unexpected ways. Walking back into Viridian Forest after this sequence causes the deferred encounter to finally trigger, but instead of facing the bug catcher, players encounter a level 1 Nidoking in wild battle. This Nidoking's appearance represents a collision of corrupted memory values, its species and level, determined by the specific sequence of actions performed. Catching this Nidoking requires patience, as its low level makes it relatively easy to capture with basic Pokeballs. The final step involves allowing this level 1 Nidoking to participate in a wild battle and gain exactly 50 experience points or less before switching to another Pokémon to finish the encounter. This precise experience threshold triggers an integer overflow in the game's experience calculation system, causing the Nidoking's level to wrap around from 1 to 100 instantly, creating a fully powered in-game Pokémon before fighting the first gym leader. The mathematical explanation for this phenomenon lies in how Generation 1 games handled experience, point calculations, and level progression. Each Pokémon species follows one of several experience curves that determine how many total experience points are needed to reach each level. Nidoking belongs to the medium-slow experience group, which requires 4,600,080 experience points to reach level 100. However, when a level 1 Nidoking gains experience, the game checks its total experience against a lookup table to determine its appropriate level. By manipulating the Nidoking's internal experience value through the specific sequence of glitches, the game incorrectly calculates that the Pokémon should be at level 100 based on corrupted memory reads, causing it to jump directly to maximum level without actually possessing the required experience points. This exploit's discovery came years after Pokémon Yellow's initial release, emerging from communities dedicated to understanding the game's underlying code structure. Speedrunners initially noticed that certain NPC interactions could be interrupted in ways that created unstable game states, leading to systematic testing of every possible combination of actions that might produce useful results. The level 100 Nidoking glitch represents one of the most practical applications of these memory manipulation techniques, as it provides an immediate access to a Pokémon powerful enough to sweep through the entire game with minimal resistance. However, performing this glitch requires such precision and knowledge of specific NPC locations and Pokémon encounters that casual players would never accidentally trigger it, making it a secret hidden in plain sight throughout the game's commercial lifespan. The philosophical implications of such exploits raise questions about what constitutes legitimate gameplay versus exploitation. In speedrunning communities, these glitches are celebrated as expressions of player mastery over game systems, demonstrations of knowledge that transcend the intended experience. Casual players might view them as cheating, bypassing the progression systems that give the journey meaning. The developers themselves likely never imagined that their code would be dissected with such thoroughness, revealing layers of complexity beneath what appeared to be a straightforward, turn-based adventure. The existence of the level 100 Nidoking glitch transforms Viridian Forest from a simple tutorial area into a location laden with potential, where understanding hidden mechanics unlocks power that reshapes the entire adventure. Red and blue players, while unable to access the specific Nidoking exploit tied to Yellow's unique NPC placement, possess their own method for bypassing Brock's gym entirely. Normally, attempting to leave Pewter City toward Mount Moon before defeating Brock triggers an interaction with the same NPC who escorts players back to the gym in Yellow. This NPC's dialogue ends with him physically walking the player back to the gym entrance, a forced interaction designed to prevent sequence breaking. However, the timing window between when his dialogue ends and when his walking animation begins can be exploited through precise menu manipulation, creating a brief moment where player input is accepted before the escort sequence fully executes. Holding the start button as the NPC's final dialogue box closes brings up the menu before the walking animation triggers. The cursor remains locked in this state, preventing normal navigation, but if it's already positioned over the save option from previous menu use, pressing A allows the player to save their game during this brief window. Completing the save causes the NPC to begin his walking animation as usual, but the act of saving and then resetting the game before the escort completes creates a desynchronized game state. When the game reloads from the save point, the player stands at the edge of Pewter City where they attempted to leave, but the NPC's position data has become corrupted by the interrupted escort sequence. The NPC attempts to complete his walking path from his original position, but the game's spatial coordinates no longer align correctly, causing him to walk through walls and eventually disappear entirely from the overworld map. Returning to the location where the NPC originally stood reveals empty space, his sprite and collision data removed from memory. Walking past this spot no longer triggers his dialogue or escort sequence, allowing players to proceed directly to Mount Moon and challenge Misty as their first gym leader instead of Brock. This sequence break became popular among players seeking to add variety to their playthroughs, as starting with a water-type gym instead of a rock-type gym fundamentally alters the early game's difficulty curve. Players who chose Charmander as their starter particularly benefited from this exploit, as skipping Brock removed the most difficult early game matchup for fire-type Pokémon. The technical explanation for why saving during the escort sequence causes the NPC to glitch involves understanding how Generation 1 games stored and updated NPC position data. Each NPC's location and behavior are tied to specific memory addresses that the game references during map transitions and save operations. When a player saves during an active movement sequence, the game attempts to store both the NPC's current position and their destination coordinates simultaneously. Upon reloading, the game tries to resume the movement sequence from the saved state, but the spatial data has become corrupted because the player's position changed during the save operation. The NPC's pathfinding algorithm receives invalid coordinates and attempts to move to a location that doesn't exist within normal map boundaries, causing the sprite to move through solid objects and eventually delete itself from active memory to prevent further errors. Brock's gym holds another peculiarity that distinguishes it from every other gym in Kanto. After defeating Brock, players receive the Boulder Badge while still on the battle screen before returning to the overworld. Every other gym leader in the game presents their badge during a post-battle dialogue scene in the overworld, creating a consistent ritual that bookends each gym challenge. Brock's unique badge presentation likely stems from how the game's battle system was programmed during early development, with his gym serving as a testing ground for badge mechanics before the developers refined the presentation style used for subsequent leaders. This inconsistency, while minor, represents a developmental artifact that reveals how the game evolved during its creation, with Brock's gym preserving an earlier iteration of badge distribution that was later standardized but never retroactively updated. The phenomenon of evolution stones and their relationship to party Pokemon's internal index numbers creates one of Generation 1's most obscure and unintuitive exploits. Each Pokemon species possesses an internal identification number used by the game's code to reference creatures in memory. These index numbers don't align with the Pokédex order that players see in-game, instead following an arbitrary sequence determined by the order in which species were programmed during development. Items also possess internal identification numbers that the game uses to determine their effects when used. Through an oversight in how the game's battle system handles memory addresses, the internal index number of a Pokémon currently active in battle can be mistakenly read by the evolution checking code as if it were an item being used on a different Pokémon. This overlap creates situations where switching to specific Pokémon during another Pokémon's level up can trigger evolution without using the appropriate stone. Staryu, for example, normally requires a water stone to evolve into Starmie, a deliberate restriction that prevents early access to one of Generation 1's strongest special attackers. However, having Staryu gain a level in battle, and then immediately switching to an Onix, causes the game to read Onix's internal index number, which happens to match the Waterstone's item identification number. The evolution checking code interprets this match as confirmation that a Waterstone was used, triggering Staryu's evolution into Starmie, despite no stone being consumed from the player's bag. This exploit works with multiple combinations of Pokemon and stones, with Exeggutor's index matching the Moonstone, Growlithe's matching the Thunderstone, and Psyduck's matching the Leafstone. The existence of these evolution glitches remained undiscovered for years because the specific Pokemon combinations required are unintuitive and contextually unlikely. Players rarely train Staryu and Onix simultaneously, and even when they do, the precise timing of leveling up Staryu and switching to Onix during the same battle seems arbitrary without knowledge of the underlying exploit. The discovery came from code analysis rather than accidental gameplay, with programmers examining the game's memory management to understand how evolution checks were performed. Once documented, these exploits became tools for challenge runs and speed runs, allowing players to access powerful, evolved forms earlier than intended without spending limited stone resources on creatures that might not remain in their final teams. The practical applications of evolution stone bypasses extend beyond simple resource conservation. In runs, where players aim to complete the Pokédex as quickly as possible, obtaining evolved forms without stones saves significant time that would otherwise be spent purchasing or finding stones scattered throughout Kanto. Additionally, some evolution forms become available before the stones themselves are accessible through normal gameplay. Players can evolve Staryu into Starmie immediately after catching it on Route 25 near Bill's house, long before obtaining access to the Celadon department store where water stones are first sold. This early access to Starmie's high special attack and speed stats dramatically shifts the difficulty curve, allowing players to steamroll through mid-game content with a Pokémon they shouldn't possess yet. The philosophical question raised by these stone exploits concerns whether using them constitutes breaking the game or simply playing it more deeply. The exploits exist within the shipped code, accessible through normal gameplay actions, without external modification or hardware manipulation. No cheat devices or ROM hacking are required, only knowledge of specific Pokémon combinations and battle sequences. From one perspective, these exploits represent unintended behavior that circumvents designed progression gates. From another, they demonstrate player mastery of complex systems, rewarding those who investigate mechanics beyond surface-level understanding. The developers never patched these exploits in later releases, suggesting either that they weren't considered serious enough to warrant fixes, or that they added depth for players willing to experiment. Celadon City's department store contains items that most players view as curiosities without practical application, but among these seemingly useless purchases lies one of the game's most powerful sequence-breaking tools. The Pokédoll, sold on the 4th floor for 1,000 Pokédollars, is described as a toy that can be used to escape wild battles regardless of the opposing Pokémon's speed or level. Most players never purchase it, viewing escape ropes and the run command as sufficient for avoiding unwanted encounters. However, the Pokédoll's categorization as a battle item rather than a field item creates an unintended interaction with how the game handles mandatory encounters that shouldn't allow escape. Lavender Town's Pokémon Tower contains a ghost encounter on the 5th floor that serves as a mandatory story barrier. This ghost, later revealed to be the spirit of a Marowak killed by Team Rocket, cannot be identified without the Sylph Scope obtained after infiltrating Team Rocket's hideout beneath Celadon Game Corner. The encounter is programmed as a wild battle, but with escape attempts disabled to force players to either defeat it or flee from the tower entirely. However, because the Pokédoll is classified as a general battle item rather than being specifically blocked for this encounter, using it successfully escapes the battle and treats the ghost as if it had been properly dealt with. The game's event flags register the encounter as completed, allowing players to proceed up the tower without obtaining the Sylph Scope, completely bypassing the entire Team Rocket hideout sequence. This skip saves significant time in speedruns, as the Team Rocket hideout represents one of the longest story dungeons in the game. The hideout spans multiple floors filled with trainers, requires navigating teleporter tile puzzles, includes a mandatory battle against Giovanni, and culminates in obtaining the Sylph Scope and rescuing Mr. Fuji. By spending 1,000 Pokédollars on a Pokédoll and using it during the ghost encounter, players eliminate over 30 minutes of gameplay from casual runs and 15 minutes from optimized speedruns. The savings come not only from skipping the hideout itself, but from avoiding all the trainer battles and wild encounters that would occur while navigating to and through the base. The discovery of the Pokédoll skip exemplifies how speedrunning communities approach game analysis. Rather than accepting designed progression paths as immutable, speedrunners systematically test every item and interaction against every mandatory encounter to identify potential shortcuts. The Pokédoll's description mentions its ability to escape any wild battle, which technically includes the ghost encounter, despite the narrative implying it shouldn't. By taking game mechanics literally rather than narratively, players identified an exploit that the developers likely never anticipated. The simplicity of the skip, requiring only a purchasable item and a single button press, contrasts with the complex memory manipulation glitches that dominate other sequence breaks, making it accessible even to casual players willing to experiment. The Pokédoll skip's impact on game design philosophy can't be overstated. Later Pokémon games specifically coded mandatory encounters to disable all escape items and abilities, closing this particular loophole. However, Generation 1's approach to encounter design prioritized flexible systems over hard-coded exceptions, resulting in emergent behaviors like the Pokédoll skip. This design philosophy, while creating exploitable gaps, also allowed for creative problem-solving and rewarded players who thought outside intended solution paths. The fact that spending a small amount of money on a seemingly useless item could bypass hours of content demonstrates how even minor game elements deserve investigation in systems-driven designs. Surfing, the ability to traverse water routes while riding atop a Pokémon, operates through collision detection that checks whether the tile beneath the player is flagged as water. The game's map designers designated water tiles with specific terrain properties that, if hits, allow surfing, while solid ground, building interiors, and most decorative objects prevent it. However, certain decorative elements were inconsistently flagged during development, creating situations where objects that should be solid are actually treated as water tiles by the game's surfing code. Statues in various locations throughout Kanto fall into this category, their collision data mistakenly set to allow surfing despite being visually solid and landlocked. The Elite Four chambers showcase this quirk most dramatically, with Lance's room containing two large statues flanking the entrance. Through a save manipulation glitch that forces the player into a surfing state on land, these statues become navigable water tiles that can be surfed upon. The glitch requires saving the game while positioned in a specific relationship to nearby water, then reloading in a way that causes the game to incorrectly believe the player is surfing. Once in this bugged surf state on land, walking onto the statue tiles maintains the surfing animation and allows the players to move through them as if they were water. This creates the surreal visual of a player character riding a Pokémon across ornamental stonework, clipping through what should be solid objects. The practical applications of statue surfing are minimal in normal gameplay, as the glitched surf state is difficult to set up and generally leads to locations the player can already access through normal means. However, in Lance's room specifically, surfing through the bottom statue and continuing downward allows the player to clip through the room's boundary and emerge in Agatha's chamber despite having just defeated her. This reverse traversal through Elite Four rooms serves no practical purpose but delights players who enjoy breaking games and accessing areas through unintended means. The ability to move backward through what should be a one-way progression path satisfies the same curiosity that drives players to explore out-of-bounds areas, and find glitched zones. The technical reason statues allow surfing relates to how Game Boy games optimized memory usage through tile reuse. Rather than creating unique collision data for every decorative object, developers assigned objects to predefined categories with shared properties. Water tiles received a specific collision flag that the surf code checked for, while solid objects received a different flag. Statues, being decorative elements placed in various contexts, were sometimes assigned the wrong collision category during map creation. The developers likely never noticed, because normal gameplay never puts players in situations where they would attempt to surf onto statues, making the misclassification invisible until glitches forced abnormal game states. The statue surfing phenomenon represents a broader category of terrain glitches that emerged from Generation 1's map system. Players discovered numerous locations where collision detection behaved unexpectedly, allowing movement through solid walls or preventing movement across seemingly open spaces. These inconsistencies stem from the manual process of defining map data, where each tile on every map required individual flagging for properties like walkability, surfability, and interaction triggers. With hundreds of maps and thousands of tiles, mistakes inevitably slipped through quality assurance. The fact that statues specifically were miscategorized suggests a systematic error in how certain decorative object classes were defined, rather than isolated mistakes on individual maps. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. The trainer fly glitch represents one of the most versatile exploits in Generation 1, allowing players to manipulate wild Pokémon encounters to spawn any species in the game. The glitch operates on the same principle as the level 100 Nidoking exploit, creating deferred encounters by interrupting trainer battles through careful positioning and menu timing. However, while the Nidoking exploit relies on specific NPCs and Pokémon in Viridian Forest, the trainer fly glitch can be performed anywhere trainers and tall grass coexist, making it significantly more flexible and powerful. The exploit's discovery revolutionized speedrunning and challenge runs, as it provides a method to obtain otherwise inaccessible Pokémon without trading or waiting until late in the game when certain species become available. The basic procedure involves positioning the player character so that a trainer's line of sight will trigger at the exact moment the player enters their visual range. Before the trainer can initiate battle dialogue, the player must open the start menu and select a Pokémon with fly or teleport, immediately escaping the area before the battle fully initializes. This creates a deferred encounter state, where the game believes a battle should occur, but hasn't properly started one yet. The deferred battle remains in memory, waiting to resolve, and will trigger automatically the next time the player enters a battle or uses certain menu functions. The specific Pokémon that appears in this triggered encounter depends on the internal data values of the last Pokémon the player encountered or battled before triggering the deferred state. By carefully controlling which Pokémon is encountered before triggering the trainer fly glitch, players can manipulate the spawned species to be anything in the game's data. Each Pokémon species has an internal index number, and by encountering a Pokémon or trainer whose last party member's special stat matches a desired species index number, players can force that species to appear in the deferred encounter. This requires extensive knowledge of internal game values, trainer rosters, and wild Pokémon stats, information that was painstakingly documented by players who reverse-engineered the game's code. Charts mapping special stat values to Pokémon index numbers became essential tools for anyone attempting advanced applications of the trainer fly glitch. The most famous application of the trainer fly glitch is encountering Mew, the mythical Pokémon that was never intended to be obtainable through normal gameplay. Mew's internal index number corresponds to a special stat value of 21, which happens to match the special stat of a Slowpoke owned by the youngster trainer on Route 25. By performing the trainer fly glitch near this trainer, defeating his Slowpoke, and then triggering the deferred encounter, players force Mew to appear in a wild battle at level 7. This discovery, made years after the game's release, shocked the Pokémon community because it provided legitimate access to Mew without requiring attendance at official Nintendo events or using external cheating devices. Players could obtain Mew on their original, unmodified cartridges simply by following a specific sequence of actions. The implications of the Mew glitch extended beyond individual game completion. For collectors and competitive players, Mew's legitimacy on cartridges obtained through this method became a topic of debate. Technically, the Mew exists within the game's code and is obtained through gameplay, even if that gameplay involves exploiting unintended behavior. Nintendo and Game Freak never officially commented on the glitch, neither patching it in later releases nor declaring such Mews illegitimate for trading or competition purposes. This ambiguity created a gray area where players had to decide for themselves whether glitched Mews counted as authentic captures or whether they violated the spirit of the collection challenge. The trainer fly glitch's versatility means it can spawn virtually any Pokémon in the game, not just Mew. Players used it to obtain version-exclusive Pokémon without trading, catch fully evolved starters early in the game, and access late-game species before reaching their normal habitat locations. The glitch effectively removes all barriers to Pokédex completion for single players without access to trading partners, democratizing the collection aspect that Nintendo had designed as a social feature. This unintended accessibility demonstrates how robust game communities can overcome designed limitations through thorough understanding of underlying systems, creating their own solutions to problems the developers expected would require cooperation. The mathematical precision required to execute trainer fly glitches consistently highlights the depth of knowledge required for advanced Generation 1 play. Players must memorize specific trainer locations, know which trainers can be used for which spawns based on their party members' stats, understand the exact positioning required to trigger interrupted battle states, and maintain careful control over which Pokémon they encounter before triggering deferred battles. This level of system mastery transforms Pokémon from a casual adventure into a complex puzzle where understanding hidden rules allows seemingly impossible achievements. The fact that these techniques exist within the unmodified game, accessible to anyone willing to learn them, speaks to the richness of systems that emerge from relatively simple rule sets. Professor Oak's unused battle data represents one of the most intriguing pieces of cut content in Pokémon Red, Blue, and Yellow. Deep within the game's code exists a complete trainer battle programmed for Professor Oak, including a full team of high-level Pokémon and battle dialogue that was never implemented in the final release. Oak's team consists of Tauros at level 66, Exeggutor at level 67, Arcanine at level 67, Gyarados at level 68, and the fully evolved form of the starter Pokémon that neither the player nor their rival chose, level 2, 69. This team composition suggests Oak was intended to be the true final boss of the game, with his challenge coming after defeating both the Elite Four and the player's rival. The discovery of Oak's battle data came from players who examined the game's code using ROM analysis tools, revealing that while the battle was programmed and functional, no trigger existed to access it during normal gameplay. The fact that Oak's team includes the third starter, the one not chosen by either the player or rival, creates a thematic completeness where Oak represents mastery of all three elemental paths. His team's levels slightly exceed those of the rival's champion team, suggesting he was meant to be even more challenging than the game's nominal final battle. The presence of powerful, fully evolved Pokémon like Gyarados and Exeggutor, neither of which are Kanto starters, shows that Oak's team was designed to be diverse and strategically challenging rather than simply powerful. Speculation about why Oak's battle was cut from the final game centers on pacing and narrative concerns. Adding a battle after the rival fight might have felt anticlimactic, as the emotional peak of defeating your childhood friend who became champion would be undermined by yet another challenge. Alternatively, the developers might have felt that Oak's character worked better as a mentor and researcher than as a trainer to be defeated, preserving his role as an authority figure above the player's competitive journey. The complete implementation of his battle, including dialogue and team composition, suggests it was cut late in development rather than being an early idea that was abandoned, indicating it likely underwent testing before being deemed inappropriate for the final experience. The trainer fly glitch can be used to access Oak's battle through memory manipulation, allowing players to fight him despite no official trigger existing. By carefully controlling memory values and forcing the game to load Oak's trainer data as an opponent, determined players can experience this cut content. His team proves challenging even for players with complete, well-trained rosters, suggesting the developers created a genuinely difficult final encounter before deciding to remove it. Fighting Oak feels like discovering a secret that was meant to stay hidden, a glimpse into an alternate version of the game where one final test awaited players after claiming the championship. The existence of fully implemented but unused content like Oak's battle raises questions about game preservation and player access to cut material. In an era before downloadable content and patches, anything included on the cartridge but not accessible through normal play was effectively lost to the vast majority of players. Only through community efforts to document and share exploitation techniques could this hidden content be experienced. Modern game design has evolved to include developer, commentary, concept art galleries, and bonus modes that showcase cut content officially, but Generation 1's hidden battles and unused features remain locked behind technical knowledge and willingness to manipulate game systems in unintended ways. The Moonwalking NPC glitch demonstrates how precise timing can break character animation systems in unexpected ways. The glitch requires interacting with NPCs who turn to face the player when approached, a common behavior programmed into many characters throughout Kanto. These NPCs have defined turning animations that play when they detect the player's presence, rotating their sprite from whichever direction they're facing to look at the player directly. The game handles this rotation through a brief animation sequence that plays before dialogue begins, creating a short window between when the NPC's turning check is triggered and when they're locked into the turning animation. By pressing the A button exactly one frame before an NPC begins their turn animation, players can interrupt the turning sequence before it properly initializes. The game registers the A button press as a dialogue initiation, causing the NPC to immediately face the player without playing the turning animation. This creates a visual snap where the NPC instantly rotates to face the player rather than smoothly turning. The real glitch occurs after the dialogue ends, when the NPC attempts to resume their original facing direction. Because their turning animation was interrupted on the approach, the game's logic becomes confused about which direction the NPC should face after dialogue concludes. Instead of turning back to their original position normally, The NPC begins walking backwards while still facing the player, creating the appearance of moonwalking. The moonwalk continues until the NPC reaches their original position and facing direction, at which point they stop moving and resume normal behavior. The sight of NPCs sliding backward across the ground while maintaining forward-facing sprites became a beloved oddity that players sought out for its pure entertainment value. The glitch serves no practical purpose and doesn't break the game or provide advantages, existing purely as a humorous animation error that rewards frame-perfect timing. Players who discovered it often demonstrated the glitch to friends, turning it into a party trick that showcased knowledge of the game's quirks. The technical reason this glitch works relates to how Generation 1 games separated animation states from movement states. An NPC's sprite direction and their walking behavior were handled by different code segments that didn't always communicate properly when animations were interrupted. The game tracked where an NPC should be facing separately from where they were walking, and interrupting the turning animation desynchronized these values. When dialogue ended, the walking code told the NPC to move back to their original position, while the sprite code maintained the interrupted facing direction, resulting in backward movement with forward-facing sprites. The moonwalking glitch represents a category of animation errors that emerged from Generation 1's modular code structure. By separating different aspects of character behavior into independent systems, the developers created flexibility that allowed NPCs to perform various actions without requiring custom code for each character. However, this modularity also meant that interrupting one system could create desynchronization with others, leading to visual glitches, like moonwalking. Later games in the series implemented more integrated character behavior systems where animations and movement were more tightly coupled, preventing these kinds of interruption-based glitches. Glitch City, the corrupted map state that players can access through Safari Zone manipulation, represents one of the most famous and extensively documented glitches in Pokémon history. The glitch requires entering the Fuchsia City Safari Zone, immediately exiting but back to the entrance, and declining when the attendant asks if you want to leave. After saving and resetting the game, returning to the Safari Zone entrance causes the attendant's dialogue to trigger incorrectly, offering to let you enter the zone when you're already outside. Declining this offer puts the game in a state where it believes you're inside the Safari Zone, but your character stands in Fuchsia City, with the step counter active, even though you're not in the designated area. This confused game state allows players to explore normally inaccessible areas by letting the step counter expire while positioned in specific locations. Giovanni's Gym in Viridian City contains spinning arrow tiles that rotate the player's sprite continuously as they stand on them. If the Safari Zone step counter reaches 0 while the player is spinning on one of these tiles, the forced exit back to the Safari Zone entrance occurs while the game is still processing the spinning animation. This creates a permanent spin state where the player's sprite continues rotating endlessly, even when moving through normal terrain. Grabbing a bicycle while in this state and jumping off a ledge causes the spinning player to perform a full 360-degree rotation mid-jump, creating the first instance of a trick being performed on a bike in Pokémon games. The glitched spin state persists until the player enters a battle or uses certain menu functions that reset animation states. Players in permanent spin mode can navigate most of Kanto with their character continuously rotating, creating a disorienting but functional way to play the game. The aesthetic of exploring familiar locations while spinning adds an absurdist quality to the experience, transforming normal gameplay into something surreal and dreamlike. Players who spent time in spin mode reported that the constant rotation made navigation difficult, but strangely compelling, as familiar paths became challenges requiring adjusted spatial awareness. Glitch City itself, the corrupted map state that can be accessed through variations of the Safari Zone glitch, consists of scrambled tile data and incorrectly rendered map chunks that create impossible geometry. The player can walk through these glitched zones, encountering wild Pokémon at unusual levels and finding strange graphical anomalies. The appearance of Glitch City varies depending on exactly when and where the step counter expires, as different memory states create different corruption patterns. Some variations look like abstract art installations, with mismatched tile set pieces creating surreal landscapes. Others resemble partially loaded maps where normal terrain exists, alongside corrupted sections, creating jarring transitions between recognizable locations and digital chaos. Exploring Glitch City became a pursuit in itself for players fascinated by broken game states. While offering no practical rewards or progression, Glitch City represented a space outside the game's intended design, a digital wilderness where normal rules didn't apply. Players documented different variations of Glitch City, mapped their layouts, and experimented with how far corruption could be pushed before the game crashed. This exploration mirrored the broader appeal of Pokémon's world, where curiosity and discovery drove players to investigate every corner of the map. Glitch City simply extended that impulse into corrupted space, treating broken code as a location to be explored rather than an error to be avoided. The Safari Zone's unique step counter mechanic, designed to limit how long players could spend catching rare Pokémon, became the key to multiple glitches, because it was one of the few timed systems in the game that continued running even when other activities interrupted it. The developers likely never anticipated players using save states and menu manipulation to create situations where the step counter expired during activities completely unrelated to the Safari Zone. This oversight created a rich vein of exploitable behavior that players mined for years, discovering new variations and applications long after the game's initial release. The relationship between glitches and game communities reveals how technical knowledge becomes social currency. Players who understood how to access Glitch City, perform trainer fly glitches, or obtain level 100 Nidokings gained status within their communities as experts and guides. This knowledge was shared through word of mouth, printed guides, early internet forums, and later through video tutorials, creating lineages of information transmission that paralleled the game's own emphasis on trading and interaction. The fact that these secrets couldn't be discovered through normal play, but required either code analysis or extensive experimentation, meant they spread through community networks, rewarding those who invested time in understanding the game's deeper systems. Modern players accessing Generation 1 games for the first time often encounter these glitches as documented techniques with clear instructions, removing the exploratory aspect that made their discovery meaningful to original audiences. Step-by-step guides reduce complex exploits to recipe-like procedures, allowing casual players to experience content that once required significant technical knowledge. This democratization of access changes how glitches are perceived, shifting them from underground secrets known only to dedicated communities to well-documented features that any interested player can utilize. The transformation from secret to common knowledge represents how game communities evolve over time, with barriers to entry lowering as collective understanding deepens. The preservation of Generation 1 glitch knowledge has become part of the broader project of game history documentation. Communities like the Cutting Room Floor catalog unused content, glitches, and development artifacts from classic games, ensuring this information remains accessible even as original players age and move on. For Pokémon specifically, sites like Glitch City Laboratories dedicated themselves to comprehensive documentation of every known exploit, complete with technical explanations and step-by-step tutorials. This archival work ensures future generations can understand and experience these quirks, treating them as legitimate parts of the game's history rather than errors to be forgotten. The aesthetic of Generation 1's glitches, particularly visual anomalies like Glitch City and corrupted sprites, has influenced game design and art communities. Modern games sometimes deliberately include glitch-like visual effects as stylistic choices, creating intentional corruption that references the unintentional errors of earlier eras. This appropriation of glitch aesthetics transforms what was once considered mistakes into artistic statements, blurring lines between error and intention. Pokémon itself has occasionally nodded to its glitchy past, with certain games, including references to Missing No or featuring Pokémon with corruption-inspired designs that recall the scrambled data of Generation 1's most famous errors. The speedrunning community's relationship with Generation 1 Pokémon games demonstrates how glitches can become central to competitive play. Rather than viewing exploits as cheating or violations of legitimate play, speedrunners embrace them as tools that allow expression of skill and knowledge. A casual player might take 20 hours to complete Pokémon Red, but speedrunners utilizing trainer fly glitches, Pokédoll skips, and other exploits complete the game in under 2 hours. These optimized runs represent thousands of hours of practice, testing, and route planning, transforming simple glitches into components of complex strategies that require perfect execution and split-second timing. Different speedrun categories create spaces for different types of play. Any percent runs allow all glitches and aim simply to reach the credits as quickly as possible, resulting in routes that skip most of the game's content through heavy exploitation. Glitchless runs prohibit memory manipulation while allowing minor exploits like the Pokédoll skip, creating middle ground challenges that require both skill and knowledge. All Pokémon runs demand catching all 151 species as quickly as possible, requiring sophisticated route planning that balances traveling time against evolution chains and rare encounter rates. Each category attracts different players with different priorities, united by the shared goal of mastering the game's systems. World record progression in Pokémon speedrunning shows how communities collectively push boundaries over time. Early runs clocked in at over 3 hours, utilizing basic route, planning and avoiding major glitches. As trainer fly and other exploits became understood, times dropped dramatically, with each new discovery shaving minutes off previous records. Modern world record runs demonstrate execution so refined that remaining time saves come from frame-perfect inputs and perfectly manipulated random number generation, representing the absolute limits of human performance within the game's systems. The history of these records maps the community's growing understanding of Generation 1's code, transforming obscure glitches into standardized techniques that any dedicated runner can learn. The social dynamics of speedrunning communities also shaped how glitch knowledge spread. Top runners developed innovative techniques but shared them freely through streaming platforms and forum posts, treating progress as a collective endeavor rather than proprietary information. This openness accelerated optimization as runners built on each other's discoveries, creating an environment where competition coexisted with collaboration. The culture of knowledge sharing extended beyond techniques to include tool-assisted speedruns, scripted playthroughs that use emulation features to test theoretical optimal strategies and discover new glitches through exhaustive systematic testing. Random number generation manipulation represents one of the most technical aspects of Generation 1 speedrunning and casual play optimization. The games generate random values for everything from wild encounters to critical hits using a pseudo-random number generator seeded by player inputs and game states. Because this RNG is deterministic rather than truly random, players who understand its mechanics can manipulate outcomes by performing specific actions at precise times. For example, opening and closing the menu a specific number of times before entering tall grass can force the next encounter to be a particular species at a desired level, allowing runners to obtain optimal team members without wasting time on unwanted encounters. Competitive battling communities also engaged with Generation 1 mechanics in ways that revealed hidden depths. While later games expanded battle systems with abilities, held items, and weather effects, Generation 1's relatively simple combat created a metagame where seemingly minor details became crucial. The absence of physical special split meant that each type was categorized as entirely physical or entirely special, creating counterintuitive situations where Pokémon with high physical attack stats couldn't effectively use moves of their own type. Psychic types dominated competitive play due to having few counters and strong offensive options, leading to centralized metagames where certain Pokémon appeared on nearly every team. Status condition mechanics in Generation 1 operated differently than in later games, with some effects being significantly more powerful. Sleep, for example, prevented Pokémon from acting on the turn they woke up, effectively giving opponents a free turn even after the sleep wore off. This made sleep-inducing moves extremely valuable in competitive play, with Pokémon like Exeggutor and Alakazam prized for their access to sleep powder and hypnosis, respectively. Freeze status was even more devastating, as frozen Pokémon couldn't thaw on their own and remained frozen indefinitely unless hit by a fire-type move. This made Blizzard and Ice Beam not just strong attacks, but potential battle-ending status inflictions, creating scenarios where a single unlucky freeze decided entire matches. The badge boost glitch represents another quirk of Generation 1's battle system, though its impact was less dramatic than some other exploits. Each badge obtained from gym leaders was supposed to provide a small stat boost to the player's Pokémon, with attack, decent defense, speed, and special stats all receiving percentage increases from specific badges. However, due to a programming error, these boosts were applied whenever the player's Pokémon's stats were recalculated, which occurred every time stat changes were made during battle. This meant that using moves like Growl or Leer to lower an opponent's stats also triggered badge boost recalculations, causing the player's Pokémon to receive badge boost bonuses multiple times within a single battle. The cumulative effect of badge boosts stacking created situations where Pokémon with all 8 badges became progressively stronger throughout long battles. Each stat modification triggered a recalculation that reapplied badge bonuses, essentially giving free stat boosts disguised as the intended badge effects. Competitive players rarely noticed this glitch because most battles ended quickly and the boosts, while present, weren't dramatic enough to be obvious. However, in prolonged battles involving multiple stat modifications, the stacking badge boosts could provide significant advantages that skewed outcomes in favor of players with more badges. This created an unintended rubber banding effect, where players who had progressed further in the gym challenge gained compounding advantages in battle. The critical hit system in Generation 1 operated on speed-based probabilities rather than the flat percentage chances used in later games. Faster Pokémon scored critical hits more frequently, creating situations where speed-based attackers like Tauros and Jolteon landed critical hits at rates exceeding 25%. This made speed one of the most valuable stats for offensive Pokémon, as it determined both turn order and critical hit frequency. Certain moves like Slash and Razor Leaf had increased critical hit ratios that stacked with speed-based probabilities, creating near-guaranteed critical hits when used by fast Pokémon. This mechanic made Persian, a Pokémon with high speed and access to Slash, surprisingly dangerous in competitive play despite its otherwise mediocre stats. Wrap, Bind, Fire Spin, and Clamp, the multi-turn trapping moves, functioned differently in Generation 1 than in later games. When these moves successfully hit, they not only dealt damage over multiple turns, but also prevented the opponent from taking any action during those turns. The opponent couldn't switch, use items, or execute moves while trapped, effectively removing their agency for the duration of the binding. This made Dragonite, which could learn Wrap and had high attack stats, capable of completely locking down opponents once a binding move landed. The mechanics of these trapping moves were widely considered broken in competitive play, leading to informal bans in many tournament formats. Hyper Beam, one of the strongest normal-type moves in Generation 1, had a glitch that made it overpowered in certain situations. Normally, Hyper Beam required the user to recharge the turn after using it, unable to execute any other action. However, if Hyper Beam knocked out the opponent's Pokémon, the recharge turn was skipped entirely, allowing the user to act normally on the next turn. This meant that powerful Pokémon like Tauros and Snorlax could spam Hyper Beam repeatedly as long as each hit knocked out the opponent, creating unstoppable offensive momentum. The glitch turned Hyper Beam from a risky high-power option into a consistently spammable move for Pokémon strong enough to guarantee knockouts. The recovery move. Rest, which fully healed the user and induced sleep status for 2 turns, operated differently in Generation 1 than in later games. The sleep duration was inconsistent, sometimes lasting 1 turn and sometimes lasting 3 or more, creating unpredictability that made rest a gamble despite its healing power. Additionally, Sleep Talk, a move that allows sleeping Pokémon to use other moves, didn't exist in Generation 1, meaning resting Pokémon were completely vulnerable during their sleep turns. This made rest less dominant in competitive play than it would become in later generations, as the risk of being knocked out while sleeping balanced the move's powerful healing effect. Substitute, a move that creates a decoy with 1/4 of the user's maximum HP, had several quirks in Generation 1 that made it stronger than intended. Substitute decoys inherited the user's status conditions when created, meaning that using Substitute while poisoned or burned transferred those conditions to the decoy. When the decoy broke, the status condition disappeared entirely, effectively curing the user for the cost of 1/4 health. This created a bizarre interaction where self-inflicted status from moves like Toxic could be weaponized as a substitute healing mechanism, allowing Pokémon to cure themselves repeatedly as long as they had HP to create new decoys. The absence of Steel and Dark types in Generation 1 meant that Psychic-type Pokémon had few reliable counters. Ghost-type moves should have been super effective against Psychic types, but a programming error caused Ghost moves to deal no damage to Psychic types at all, removing the intended counter entirely. Bug-type moves were super effective against Psychic types as intended, but Bug-type Pokémon were generally weak with poor move pools, making them ineffective in practice. This combination of factors created a metagame where Psychic types dominated, with Alakazam, Exeggutor, and Starmie appearing on virtually every competitive team. Focus, energy, and dire hit, moves intended to increase critical hit ratios, were bugged in Generation 1 and actually decreased critical hit chances instead of increasing them. The code that handled these moves contained an error that inverted their effect, making Pokémon less likely to score critical hits after using them. Players who relied on these moves without understanding the bug found themselves at a disadvantage, wondering why their critical hit-focused strategies underperformed. The bug wasn't widely known during the game's initial release, as most players didn't have access to code analysis tools that would reveal the inverted effect. Counter, a move that returns physical damage back to the attacker at double power, had strange prioritization in Generation 1. If both Pokémon used counter on the same turn, an infinite loop could occur where the game repeatedly calculated counter damage without resolving the turn. This rare situation required specific circumstances, but could crash the game when triggered, representing one of the few glitches that could corrupt save files. Players who encountered this bug often lost progress if they hadn't saved recently, making counter usage risky in mirror matches. The trading system's mechanics created the opportunities for obtaining Pokémon with impossible movesets through careful exploitation. Certain Pokémon could learn moves via TMs that they couldn't normally learn, and when traded to another game, these moves persisted even though they shouldn't exist. This allowed creation of Pokémon with competitive advantages unavailable through normal gameplay, such as Fissure-knowing Machamps or Psychic-knowing Gengar. These glitched movesets became controversial in competitive communities, with some tournaments allowing them and others banning Pokémon with impossible move combinations. The relationship between Generation 1's code and later generations' bug fixes reveals how developers learned from their early mistakes. Many exploits, glitches, and balance issues from Red, Blue, and Yellow were carefully addressed in Gold and Silver, with revised code structures that prevented memory manipulation, fixed critical hit calculations, balanced type matchups by introducing Steel and Dark types, and standardized move effects to eliminate inconsistent behavior. This iterative improvement process demonstrates how game franchises evolve through community feedback and eternal reflection, with each generation building on lessons learned from previous entries. The cultural impact of Generation 1 glitches extends beyond the games themselves into broader discussions about game ownership and player rights. When players purchase a game, do they own only the intended experience, or do they also own the unintended behaviors present in the code? Speedrunners and glitch enthusiasts argue that anything accessible through unmodified cartridges represents legitimate gameplay, while others contend that exploiting programming errors violates the spirit of designed experiences. This philosophical debate has no clear resolution, with different communities drawing boundaries in different places based on their values and priorities. The preservation of original Generation 1 cartridges has become important to communities that value authentic hardware experiences over emulation. While emulators perfectly replicate most behaviors, certain edge cases and timing-dependent glitches behave slightly differently on original game, compared to software emulation. Speedrunners often practice on emulators for convenience, but verify records on authentic hardware to ensure legitimacy, recognizing that subtle differences in timing and processing can affect glitch execution. This emphasis on hardware authenticity creates demand for well-maintained original cartridges, with certain versions commanding premium prices among collectors and competitive players. Battery save technology used in Generation 1 cartridges to maintain save data without external power has become a preservation concern as original cartridges age. The internal batteries that maintain save states have finite lifespans, typically lasting 15 to 20 years before failing. When batteries die, save data is lost, though the cartridge remains playable, with saving functionality restored after battery replacement. This planned obsolescence, built into physical media, creates urgency around preservation efforts, as original save files, representing decades-old playthroughs, are at risk of permanent loss without an intervention. The secondary market for Pokémon cartridges has been influenced by knowledge of glitches and exploits. Cartridges containing rare glitched Pokémon, such as legitimate Mews obtained through trainer fly exploits, sometimes sell for premiums compared to standard copies. Collectors value these cartridges for their unique contents, treating glitched Pokémon as artifacts worth preserving. This creates interesting situations where game states that developers never intended become valuable precisely because of their unintended nature, inverting typical relationships between error and value. ROM hacking communities have used Generation 1's accessible code structure to create countless fan-made modifications that add new content, fix bugs, or completely reimagine the game. These hacks range from simple, quality-of-life improvements that fix glitches and balance issues to total conversion mods that add new regions, Pokémon, and storylines. The existence of robust hacking communities demonstrates how Generation 1's lasting appeal drives continued engagement decades after release, with fans creating content that extends the game's lifespans indefinitely through constant iteration and experimentation. The relationship between official Pokémon releases and fan-created modifications has remained complicated, with Nintendo historically opposing ROM distribution and fan games while occasionally incorporating community-discovered elements into official products. This tension between corporate control and fan creativity defines modern gaming culture, where passionate communities want to extend and modify beloved franchises, while rights holders seek to maintain brand integrity and commercial value. Generation 1 glitches exist in an ambiguous space within this relationship, neither officially sanctioned nor explicitly condemned, tolerated as harmless quirks that add character to classic games. Educational initiatives have emerged around Generation 1 glitching, with some computer science instructors using Pokémon exploits as teaching tools to demonstrate programming concepts. The trainer fly glitch, for example, illustrates memory management and how different game systems share address spaces, making it useful for teaching about pointer manipulation and buffer overflows. The integer overflow that creates level 100 Nidokings demonstrates how numerical calculations can produce unexpected results when values exceed defined ranges, a concept fundamental to understanding computer arithmetic limitations. The speedrunning community's documentation practices have created comprehensive knowledge repositories that serve as historical records of Generation 1 optimization techniques. Sites like speedrun.com maintain leaderboards with attached video evidence, creating archives of record-breaking runs that show how strategies have evolved over time. These records serve as both competitive venues and educational resources, with aspiring runners studying top performances to learn techniques and understand decision-making processes. The combination of competition and education creates self-reinforcing communities where knowledge sharing directly contributes to pushing boundaries further. As we drift into the closing reflections on Generation 1's obscure secrets, the overwhelming impression is one of depth beneath simplicity. These games, designed for children and constrained by primitive hardware, contain complexities that have sustained dedicated communities for nearly 3 decades. The glitches, exploits, and hidden behaviors weren't intended features, but they became defining characteristics that shaped how multiple generations of players experienced and remembered these foundational games. The secrets within Generation 1. Pokémon games represent more than programming errors or exploitation opportunities. They embody the unexpected richness that emerges when players engage deeply with systems, when curiosity drives investigation beyond intended boundaries, and when communities form around shared knowledge of hidden mechanics. The legacy of these secrets extends into modern game design philosophy, where developers increasingly recognize that emergent behaviors and player-discovered techniques often become beloved features that define games as much as designed content. Speedrunning communities, glitch enthusiasts, and challenge runners have demonstrated that deep engagement with game systems creates value that extends far beyond original design intent, adding layers of meaning and possibility that enrich experiences for those willing to explore beyond surface-level play. Generation 1's obscure secrets remind us that games are conversations between designers and players, with both sides contributing to the final experience. When players discovered the level 100 Nidoking glitch, found Professor Oak's hidden battle, or first encountered Mew through trainer fly manipulation, they weren't breaking the game, but revealing it, exposing layers that existed beneath the intended adventure, waiting quietly for someone curious enough to look. The Pokémon storage system, managed through Bill's PC, contains the hidden mechanics that influence how stored Pokémon behave and interact with game data. Each box can hold 20 Pokémon, and the game provides 12 total boxes, creating storage space for 240 creatures beyond the 6-member party. However, accessing boxes beyond the first few requires navigating through the interface repeatedly, as the game only displays one box at a time, with no quick navigation options. This tedious interface led many players to maintain minimal storage, keeping only their active team and a few backup Pokémon while releasing others to free space. The box switching mechanic contains an interesting quirk where changing boxes requires exiting the PC system entirely and re-entering it, as boxes can't be switched while Pokémon are being deposited or withdrawn. This design decision, likely made to simplify the interface and reduce memory requirements, created frustration for players managing large collections. The process of organizing Pokémon across boxes involved repeated entry and exit sequences, with each transition requiring several button presses and menu confirmations. Players who attempted to complete the Pokédex found themselves spending significant time simply managing storage, moving Pokémon between boxes to create space for new captures. Certain Pokémon names, when entered during the naming process, triggered unintended behaviors due to how the game handled text strings. The name Trainer, for example, if given to a wild Pokémon and then encountered, caused the game to treat the encounter as a trainer battle rather than a wild battle. This created situations where wild Pokémon appeared with trainer battle, music, and interface elements, though the battle proceeded normally otherwise. The quirk stemmed from how the game checked battle types, comparing text strings and memory to determine whether encounters should be treated as wild or trainer-initiated. The old man in Viridian City, who demonstrates how to catch Pokémon, plays a crucial role in several glitches beyond the trainer fly exploit. His tutorial sequence temporarily replaces the player's name in memory with Old Man to display properly during the catching demonstration. This name substitution interacts with wild encounter generation in unexpected ways, as the player's name is normally used as part of the random seed for determining wild Pokémon characteristics. While the name is changed to Old Man, any wild encounters generated use this temporary name for calculations, creating specific predictable encounter patterns. This name-swapping mechanic became the foundation for the Missing No glitch, one of Generation 1's most famous and widely documented exploits. After viewing the old man's tutorial, flying directly to Cinnabar Island, and surfing along the eastern coast triggers encounters that reference corrupted memory addresses. The game attempts to generate wild Pokémon based on data stored where the player's name normally exists, but because Old Man still occupies that space temporarily, the encounter system reads invalid data and generates glitch Pokémon. Missing No, the most common result, appears as a corrupted sprite resembling scrambled pixels and possesses wildly inconsistent stats and typing. Encountering Missing No itself is relatively harmless, rarely causing save corruption or permanent damage, despite urban legends suggesting otherwise. However, catching Missing No or allowing it to appear in the player's party can cause graphical glitches in PC storage boxes, corrupting the sprites of properly obtained Pokémon without affecting their actual data. These sprite corruptions persist until the affected Pokémon are deposited and withdrawn from the PC, which resets their sprite display. The visual corruption led many players to fear that Missing No encounters damaged save files, though in practice the glitch primarily affected temporary display elements rather than core save data. The most famous effect of encountering Missing No is the item duplication glitch it triggers. When Missing No appears in battle, the game incorrectly increments the quantity of the sixth item in the player's bag by 128 units. This occurs because Missing No's encounter routine writes values to memory addresses that overlap with item storage, creating unintended duplication. Players quickly discovered that placing rare items like rare candies or master balls in the sixth item slot before encountering Missing No resulted in obtaining over 100 of those items instantly, completely breaking the game's intended resource management and progression systems. The item duplication glitch became one of the most widely used exploits among casual players, as it required no complex inputs or precise timing compared to other glitches. Simply arranging items correctly, viewing the old man's tutorial, flying to Cinnabar, and surfing on the eastern coast generated Missing No encounters that duplicated items. This accessibility meant that even players with limited technical knowledge could benefit from the glitch, spreading its use far beyond hardcore glitching communities. The ability to obtain infinite rare candies allowed players to level Pokémon to 100 instantly, while infinite Master Balls made catching legendary Pokémon trivial, fundamentally altering how many players experienced the game. The ethical questions surrounding item duplication mirror broader debates about glitch usage and legitimate play. Obtaining infinite resources through glitches gives players advantages that trivialize challenges the developers carefully balanced around scarcity. Rare. Candies are intentionally limited to force players to train Pokémon through battles, creating investment in their teams. Master Balls are unique items meant for the single most important capture of a playthrough, forcing strategic decisions about when to use them. Bypassing these limitations through exploitation undermines designed progression systems, though players argue that single-player games allow freedom to play however one wishes without affecting others' experiences. Nintendo and Game Freak never officially addressed the item duplication glitch during Generation 1's active commercial life, neither patching it in later releases nor commenting on its legitimacy. This silence left players to form their own conclusions about whether using the glitch constituted cheating or simply taking advantage of available game mechanics. Different player communities developed different norms, with some treating glitched items as illegitimate and others accepting them as fair use of in-game exploits. This moral ambiguity surrounding glitch usage highlighted how single-player games create spaces where players define their own rules and boundaries. The coastline of Cinnabar Island, where Missing-No appears, became a pilgrimage site for players seeking to duplicate items, with the specific tile patterns along the eastern shore burned into the memory of countless players. The surreal experience of encountering a glitched Pokémon that resembled digital corruption made tangible added mystique to the process, transforming item duplication from a simple exploit into a ritual that felt transgressive and exciting. Players often shared stories of their first Missing-No encounter, describing the shock of seeing the scrambled sprite and the satisfaction of checking their bag to find impossibly large item quantities. The Missing-No phenomenon extended into popular culture beyond the game itself, with the glitch Pokémon appearing in internet discussions, fan art, and even unofficial merchandise. The concept of a Pokémon that exists due to programming errors rather than intentional design captured imaginations and inspired creative interpretations. Some fan theories attempted to explain Missing-No as a canonical creature rather than a glitch, creating elaborate backstories about its origins and purpose. These creative appropriations of glitch content demonstrated how players constructed meaning around unintended game elements, treating them as features worthy of celebration rather than errors to be corrected. The existence of multiple Missing-No variants, each with different types and stats based on the player's name and other variables, added complexity to the glitch. Some encounters generated Missing-No with normal type and bird type combinations, while others created water type or glitch type variants. These different forms had no practical significance, but created a collection aspect even within glitched content, with players documenting the various Missing-No types they encountered. The categorization and documentation of glitch variants mirrors the core Pokémon collection mechanics, suggesting that players will organize and catalog anything the game presents, intentional or otherwise. M, another glitch Pokémon accessible through similar means as Missing-No, appeared as a yellow highlighted question mark block that resembled corrupted text displays. M served essentially the same function as Missing-No in triggering item duplication, making it an equally valuable encounter for players seeking to exploit the glitch. The name M itself represented corrupted character data, with the game attempting to display a species name but finding invalid values in memory. Encountering M felt even more explicitly broken than Missing-No, as its appearance as a text character rather than a sprite made its nature as corrupted data immediately obvious. The technical explanation for why Missing-No and M exist involves understanding how generation, one's encounter tables function. Each area's wild Pokémon are stored in memory as lists that the game references when generating encounters. The Cinnabar Coast, being a location where the old man's tutorial temporarily affects encounter generation, lacks properly defined wild encounter data. When the game tries to generate a Pokémon for this area, while the player's name is replaced by Old Man, it reads from memory addresses that should contain valid Pokémon data, but instead contain remnants of the name string. These invalid values correspond to glitch Pokémon species that were never meant to exist, creating encounters that bypass normal data validation. The item duplication triggered by Missing-No occurs because the encounter routine for these glitch species incorrectly writes to memory addresses that overlap with item storage. Each item in the bag is stored with a quantity value at a specific memory address, and the sixth item's quantity happens to share an address that Missing-No's encounter routine modifies. The value written to this address is 128, the maximum quantity a single item stack can hold, which replaces whatever quantity previously existed. This creates the duplication effect, as items that previously had small quantities suddenly possess the maximum possible amount. Players who understood these technical details use them to create more sophisticated exploits beyond simple item duplication. By carefully controlling which items occupied the sixth slot and manipulating other variables, advanced players could corrupt memory in ways that granted access to otherwise unobtainable items, created impossible Pokémon with glitched stats, or triggered events out of sequence. These advanced applications of the missing no glitch require deep knowledge of memory addresses and game structure, separating casual exploiters who simply wanted infinite rare candies from dedicated glitchers who viewed the entire game as a playground for memory manipulation. The bicycle storage mechanic contains a quirk where the bike, classified as a key item, cannot be sold or thrown away despite taking up inventory space. This permanent inventory slot allocation becomes inconvenient for players who want to maximize their available item storage, as the bicycle remains in the bag forever after obtaining it from the bike shop. The decision to make the bicycle unsellable likely stemmed from concerns about players accidentally removing it and becoming unable to access areas requiring bike travel, though this protection came at the cost of inventory flexibility. HM moves, the permanent field abilities taught to Pokémon, create another inventory management challenge. While TMs can be used once and disappear from the bag, HMs remain forever and cannot be deleted from Pokémon without visiting a specific move deleter NPC. However, Generation 1 lacks a move deleter entirely, meaning any Pokémon that learns an HM move becomes permanently locked with that move in its move pool. This created situations where players accidentally taught HMs to Pokémon they intended to use competitively, only to find themselves unable to remove suboptimal moves like Cut or Flash that occupied slots needed for battle-relevant moves. The decision to make HMs permanent and undeletable reflected design philosophy, prioritizing preventing player frustration over allowing flexibility. If players could freely delete HMs, they might remove Surf from all their Pokémon and become trapped on islands, unable to progress. Making HMs permanent ensured that players always had access to field abilities needed for navigation, though this safety came at the cost of move pool flexibility. Later generations addressed this issue by introducing move deleters, who could remove HMs in exchange for the risk of players trapping themselves, trusting players to manage their own progression rather than enforcing safeguards through permanent moves, the Casesus. Safari Zone's unique catching mechanics, replacing traditional battles with a bait and rock system, create statistical puzzles that optimal play can solve. Each wild Pokémon in the Safari Zone has hidden values determining how likely they are to flee and how difficult they are to catch. Throwing bait makes Pokémon less likely to flee, but harder to catch, while throwing rocks makes them more likely to flee, but easier to catch. Optimal Safari Zone strategies involve calculating the expected number of turns available before each species flees and determining whether bait or rocks improve catch probabilities. However, due to quirks in how the Safari Zone's flee mechanics are programmed, the system doesn't function quite as intended. Throwing bait or rocks modifies internal values that should affect flee rates and catch rates proportionally, but rounding errors in the calculations create situations where certain combinations are strictly better or worse than others. Speedrunners and optimization enthusiasts have calculated that for most Pokémon, throwing Safari Balls immediately, without using bait or rocks, provides the best probability of capture, as the modifications from bait and rocks often hurt more than they help due to implementation errors. The step limit in the Safari Zone, restricting players to 500 steps before forced exit, creates tension in an area designed around exploration and glitching rare Pokémon. Players must balance moving through zones to find desired species against spending time in each encounter trying to catch them. This risk-reward calculation becomes particularly acute when hunting for rare Pokémon like Tauros or Chansey that appear infrequently and may require multiple Safari Balls to catch. The step limit forces decisions about when to give up on an encounter and move on versus committing resources to difficult captures. The Super Rod, obtained from the fishing guru in Route 12, unlocks access to Pokémon that cannot be encountered through normal surfing or lower quality rods. However, the game's fishing mechanics contain probabilistic elements that make catching specific species unpredictable even with the correct rod in the correct location. Each fishing spot has a table of possible Pokémon with different encounter rates, and the game randomly selects from this table each time a fish bites. This creates situations where players can fish dozens of times in a location, trying to encounter a specific species, only to repeatedly get more common alternatives. The fishing guru NPC who provides the super rod requires players to answer yes to his question about patience, creating a minor puzzle that some players miss if they habitually answer no to NPC questions. This check ensures that players consciously accept the tool rather than receiving it accidentally, though the binary choice doesn't affect the rod's function once obtained. The dialogue serves as a gentle test of player attention, rewarding those who actually read NPC text rather than mashing through it automatically. Dig and Teleport, moves that instantly return players to the last Pokémon Center visited, function identically for transportation purposes, but exist on different Pokémon learn sets. Dig is a ground-type move learned by several common Pokémon, like Sandshrew and Diglett, while Teleport is a Psychic-type move, exclusive to Abra in its evolutions. This redundancy in escape moves gives players options based on team composition, ensuring that most players have access to instant transportation regardless of which Pokémon they train. The move's identical functionality, but different type classifications, reflects Generation 1's occasional inconsistencies in how similar effects were categorized. Escape Rope, a consumable item that serves the same function as Dig and Teleport, provides a third option for players who don't have appropriate Pokémon or don't want to dedicate a move slot to transportation. The existence of 3 mechanically identical escape options demonstrates how Generation 1 prioritized player agency and flexibility, ensuring multiple viable paths to solve common problems. This design philosophy, where redundant systems provided choices rather than forcing specific solutions, contributed to the game's accessibility and allowed players to progress using diverse team compositions and strategies. The variety of status healing items, from antidotes to paralyze heals to awakenings, creates inventory management challenges as players accumulate single-purpose curatives that treat specific conditions. Full heals, which cure all status conditions simultaneously, eventually replace these specialized items, but their higher cost and later availability force players to maintain diverse healing inventories throughout most of the game. This progressive item unlocking creates a sense of advancement as better options become available, though it also means carrying multiple item types that serve overlapping functions. X items, the consumable battle stat boosters like X attack and X defense, rarely see use in casual playthroughs, despite being readily available for purchase. These items provide temporary stat increases during battle, but disappear after the battle ends, creating a psychological barrier where players hoard them for important fights that never feel important enough to justify consumption. This too good to use phenomenon, where powerful consumables remain in inventory indefinitely because players always anticipate needing them more later, reduces X items to vendor trash that occupies bag space without serving practical functions. Competitive players, however, recognize X items' potential for sweeping battles through setup strategies. Using X speed to guarantee outspeeding opponents, or X special to boost special attack to overwhelming levels, can turn marginally viable Pokémon into temporary powerhouses. The willingness to consume items for advantage rather than hoarding them indefinitely separates competitive mindsets from casual play patterns, demonstrating how different player goals create different relationships with game resources. Guard Spec and Dire Hit, two X items that modify battle mechanics rather than directly boosting stats, suffer from bugs that reduce their effectiveness. Guard Spec is supposed to prevent stat reduction from opponent moves, but implementation errors cause it to function inconsistently. Dire Hit, as mentioned earlier, inverts critical hit ratios rather than increasing them due to coding mistakes. These bugs render both items effectively useless, as their intended functions don't work, and players who use them without knowing about the bugs find themselves at disadvantages rather than gaining expected advantages. The secret key, obtained after defeating Giovanni in the Sylph Company building, unlocks the Cinnabar gym door and allows players to challenge Blaine. This key item serves no purpose beyond unlocking a single door, yet it occupies permanent inventory space, like the bicycle. The decision to make a one-time use unlocking item into a key item that can't be discarded seems like an oversight, as key item status should be reserved for tools with repeated functionality. Once the Cinnabar gym door is unlocked, the secret key serves no further purpose but remains in the bag indefinitely. The gold teeth found in the Safari Zone and returned to the Warden in exchange for HM04 strength follow a similar pattern of single-use key items that permanently occupy inventory. These one-time quest items could have been automatically consumed upon completion of their associated tasks, freeing inventory space, but instead remain as permanent reminders of completed objectives. The accumulation of obsolete key items clutters the bag interface and forces players to scroll past irrelevant items when searching for functional tools. The SS Ann's departure after this. The player obtains HM01 cut represents one of the few permanent missable locations in the game. Once the ship leaves Vermilion City, all items, trainers, and Pokémon encounters aboard become permanently inaccessible for that save file. This creates anxiety for completionist players who worry about missing items or trainer battles before the ship departs. However, nothing truly essential exists exclusively on the SS Anne, as all encounters and items can be obtained elsewhere or are non-unique. The ship's departure serves primarily as a narrative beat that creates a sense of time passing and opportunities closing. Urban legends about preventing the SS Anne's departure circulated widely, despite being false, with players claiming that specific actions could keep the ship docked permanently. These myths, spread through schoolyard conversations and early internet forums, exemplified how misinformation propagated in gaming communities before widespread access to reliable information sources. The desire to preserve the SS and reflected a broader anxiety about missing content, with players wanting to explore every area completely before moving forward. This completionist drive created stress around one-time events and missable content that later game designs would address through more forgiving systems. The Nugget Bridge reward system, where defeating 5 trainers in sequence leads to a Team Rocket grunt offering recruitment, creates one of the game's earliest moral choice moments. Players can accept the recruitment offer and receive a nugget, or refuse and battle the grunt instead. The choice has no long-term consequences beyond the immediate battle and reward, as joining Team Rocket isn't actually possible regardless of the player's response. This false choice creates the illusion of moral agency without committing to branching narratives, allowing players to feel like their decisions matter while maintaining a single linear story path. The nugget itself, a valuable item that sells for 5,000 Pokédollars, provides significant early game money for players who defeat the bridge trainers and either join or refuse Team Rocket. This monetary boost allows purchasing items or TMs that might otherwise be unaffordable at that stage, accelerating progression for players who know about the bridge's reward. The Nugget Bridge became a famous location partly due to this reward, with players remembering it as a generous mid-game money source that made subsequent purchases easier. Bill's house on Route 25 contains one of the game's stranger NPC interactions, with Bill appearing initially as a Pokemon-human hybrid trapped in his teleporter. Helping him return to normal form rewards the player with a ticket to the SS Anne, creating a quest chain that connects multiple story beats. The absurdist humor of Bill being merged with a Pokemon and needing the player's help to separate pushes against the game's generally serious tone, creating a memorable moment that stands out from typical NPC interactions. The secret house, hidden deep in the Safari Zone, accessible only after navigating complex maze-like paths and knowing where to search, contains HM03 Surf. This HM, essential for accessing water routes throughout the second half of the game, is hidden behind optional content in an area many players might skip. The decision to place crucial progression tools in optional locations creates situations where players can get stuck if they miss important areas, though in practice most players naturally explore the Safari Zone thoroughly enough to find the house. The Rare Candies experience bypass, granting a full level instantly without any experience points, creates debates about whether using them is legitimate or constitutes a form of soft cheating. On one hand, rare candies are official items placed in the game by developers, and obtaining them through normal exploration involves no glitches or exploits. On the other hand, they bypass the training process that creates investment in Pokémon and trivialize level progression if used liberally. Players who use rare candies extensively often find their Pokémon underperforming in late-game battles because they missed out on stat growth that occurs through normal level-ups. However, this received wisdom about rare candy harming stat growth is actually a myth stemming from misunderstandings about how the game calculates stats. Pokémon gain stats based on base stats, individual values, and the effort values regardless of how they level up. Using rare candies doesn't reduce stats compared to leveling through battle, though Pokémon that battle frequently accumulate effort values that boost specific stats. The perceived weakness of rare candy-leveled Pokémon actually stems from effort value differences rather than the leveling method itself, but the myth persists because it aligns with intuitions about earning progress through effort rather than shortcuts. Effort values in Generation 1, called stat experience internally, accumulate invisibly as Pokémon battle, with each defeated opponent granting points in specific stats based on that opponent's species. These points accumulate up to a maximum of 65,535 per stat, creating significant stat bonuses for Pokémon that battle extensively. The system was intentionally hidden from players, operating entirely in the background without any interface indication of current values or progress toward caps. This invisibility meant that most players trained Pokémon without understanding the underlying stat growth mechanics, creating organic variation in team strength based on battle history rather than conscious stat optimization. Competitive players who understood effort values could optimize training by selectively battling opponents that granted desired stat boosts, creating Pokémon with maximized stats in crucial areas. This knowledge gap between casual and competitive players created significant power differences, with optimized Pokémon dramatically outperforming casually trained ones even at identical levels with identical individual values. The hidden nature of effort values meant that casual players often couldn't understand why their Pokémon were weaker than similarly leveled ones used by knowledgeable players, creating frustration and mystification around competitive viability. Later generations would revamp the effort value system entirely, implementing more transparent mechanics with visible indicators and lower maximum values that required strategic distribution rather than maxing every stat. Generation 1's implementation, while influential in establishing stat customization through training, was opaque and grindy, requiring extensive battles against specific opponents to fully maximize a Pokémon's potential. Modern players returning to Generation 1 often find the hidden effort value system off-putting after experiencing more transparent iterations in later games, though some appreciate the mysterious depth that reveals itself only through dedicated research. Individual values, the hidden stats that create natural variation between Pokémon of the same species, function differently in Generation 1 than in later games. IVs in Generation 1 are determined by a Pokémon's defense, speed, and special stats, with attack determined by the defense 4 and HP calculated from other stats. This limited set of independent variables means that certain stat combinations are impossible, as all stats derive from only a few base values. The system creates less variation than later generations' implementations, though it still produces noticeable differences between the individual Pokémon. The relationship between IVs and gender, implemented in Generation 2 for species caught in Generation 1 and traded forward, creates situations where high-attack Pokémon are statistically more likely to be male. This occurs because the gender determination system in Generation 2 reads the attack 4 value from transferred Pokémon and uses it to assign gender based on species-specific gender ratios. Female Pokémon in species with skewed gender ratios require low attack equivos, creating an inherent trade-off between having female Pokémon and having high attack Pokémon for certain species. This quirk affects Pokémon like the starters, which have 7-to-1 male-to-female ratios and therefore rarely appear as females with competitive IV spreads. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town contains multiple floors of ghost-type Pokémon encounters, but oddly includes channelers who use ghost types in trainer battles despite ghost moves being essentially useless against most opponents. Lick, the only damaging ghost-type move available in Generation 1, has low base power and suffers from the programming error that makes ghost moves ineffective against psychic types despite being listed as super effective. This makes channelers, haunters, and Gengars rely primarily on psychic-type moves like Hypnosis and Dream Eater rather than their ghost-type stab attacks, creating situations where ghost specialists barely use ghost moves. The narrative context of the Pokémon Tower, a graveyard for deceased Pokémon where spirits linger, creates one of the game's darker atmospheric moments. The channeler's presence suggests spiritual practitioners attempting to commune with or calm the dead, though the game never explains their specific role or why they challenge trainers who enter the tower. This ambiguity creates an unsettling tone that separates the tower from the other locations, making it feel genuinely different from typical Pokémon environments where battles occur for sport or training purposes, rather than seeming territorial defense of sacred ground. The Marowak ghost encounter triggers upon reaching the tower's upper floors, creating a mandatory battle that cannot be won through normal means. The ghost's sprite appears as a shadowy silhouette that the game explicitly labels as unidentifiable without the sylph scope, treating it as unique even among other ghost-type encounters in the same location. This special status makes the Marowak ghost feel like a genuine supernatural presence rather than simply another wild Pokémon, creating narrative weight through mechanical distinctiveness. The emotional impact of the Marowak ghost story, revealed through dialogue after obtaining the Sylph Scope, creates one of Generation 1's rare moments of genuine tragedy. Team Rocket murdered the Marowak while it defended its baby Cubone, leaving the child orphaned and the mother's spirit trapped in rage and grief. This backstory, while told briefly through minimal text, establishes stakes beyond typical cartoon villainy, portraying Team Rocket as genuinely dangerous and morally reprehensible. The player's role in laying the Marowak's spirit to rest through battle creates a cathartic narrative beat that resolves this tragedy while acknowledging that the harm can't be undone. Capturing and training Mewtwo after learning its backstory creates cognitive dissonance as the player becomes complicit in the same pattern of human domination over Pokémon that Team Rocket represents. This moral complexity rarely surfaces in Generation 1's actual gameplay, as the narrative doesn't acknowledge the contradiction between reading about Mewtwo's tragic creation and then immediately seeking to catch it. Later games and movies would explore these themes more directly, portraying Mewtwo as a character wrestling with questions of identity and autonomy, but Generation 1 presents it primarily as a powerful legendary to be captured and used. The Victory Road dungeon, final gauntlet before the Pokémon League, requires all HMs obtained throughout the journey to navigate completely. Strength moves boulders into holes, creating paths that allow progress deeper into the cave. Flash illuminates dark sections, making navigation possible without stumbling blindly. Surf crosses water channels that divide different areas. This integration of field moves into dungeon design creates a sense that the entire journey has prepared players for this final test, with tools gathered throughout Kanto all becoming necessary for completion. The trainers within Victory Road use fully evolved Pokémon with competitive movesets, creating battles that test strategic thinking rather than simply level advantages. Players accustomed to breezing through routes with overleveled starters often struggle in Victory Road, as the concentration of skilled trainers and strong wild encounters creates sustained pressure. The dungeon's length ensures that reaching the Pokémon League requires either careful resource management or multiple trips back to Viridian City's Pokémon Center, adding time and effort to the final approach. Emerging from Victory Road onto Route 23 creates a moment of relief, as the path forward becomes linear and obstacle-free. The final stretch before Indigo Plateau feels like a victory lap, with no trainers or wild encounters interrupting the approach. This deliberate pacing allows players to appreciate reaching the endgame, creating anticipation for the Elite Four challenge without immediately throwing them into battle. The Pokémon Center at the plateau's entrance provides final preparation opportunities, allowing players to heal, reorganize teams, and purchase last-minute items before committing to the championship challenge. The Elite Four's structure, 4 consecutive battles without healing opportunities followed by the rival champion, creates the game's ultimate test of team composition and resource management. Players must conserve HP and PP across 5 battles, balancing aggression against caution to ensure their team survives to the end. This gauntlet format rewards balanced teams that can handle diverse threats rather than hyper-specialized squads that excel against some opponents but struggle against others. Lorelei's Ice-type team opens the Elite Four challenge, testing players' ability to counter a type that resists many common attacking types. Her Dugong, Cloyster, Jinx, and Lapras create a balanced squad that combines physical defense, special offense, and status effects. Players who rely heavily on grass, flying, or ground types often struggle against Lorelei, as ice moves devastate these Pokémon, while ice types resist their attacks. Successfully countering her team requires either type advantage through fighting, rock, or fire Pokémon, or overwhelming levels that bypass type disadvantages through raw stats. Bruno's fighting type specialization creates an opportunity for psychic type sweeps, as fighting moves deal pathetically weak damage to psychic Pokémon, while psychic moves obliterate fighting types. His team of Onix, Hitmonchan, Hitmonlee, and more Onix creates a relatively easy battle for players with strong psychic attackers, though his Pokemon's high physical attack stats threaten teammates weak to fighting moves. The type matchup knowledge gained throughout the journey becomes crucial here, as players who understand how fighting and psychic types interact can trivialize Bruno, while those who don't may struggle despite having higher leveled teams. Agatha's Ghost and Poison specialization creates one of the more challenging Elite Four battles, despite Ghost type's mediocre offensive presence. Her Golbats inflict confusion through supersonic, disrupting player strategies and creating randomness that can derail otherwise solid game plans. Her Gengars combine strong special attack with access to psychic moves that hit harder than their Ghost-type stabby options, creating situations where her supposed specialty type barely features in optimal strategies. The prevalence of poison types in her team creates opportunities for ground and psychic attacks, though her Pokemon's high speed stats mean many will outpace unprepared players. Lance's Dragon specialization creates the Elite Four's climactic battle before the champion, as dragon types are rare and powerful throughout Generation 1. His team features 3 Dragonites alongside Gyarados and Aerodactyl, creating a flying heavy composition vulnerable to electric and ice attacks, but devastating to unprepared teams. The Dragonites know Hyper Beam, exploiting the glitch that allows spamming this powerful move if it knocks out opponents, creating situations where Lance can sweep entire teams if allowed to build momentum. Ice-type attacks from Pokémon like Lapras or Jinx destroy his dragons quickly, but players without ice coverage often struggle to overcome his high-level team through neutral damage alone. The rival's champion team, final obstacle before completing the game, represents the culmination of the parallel journey that began back in Pallet Town. His team varies, based on which starter he chose, creating 3 possible final battles with different compositions and strategies. Fighting the childhood friend who started the same day, trained alongside the player throughout Kanto, and ultimately claimed the championship first, creates emotional stakes beyond typical boss battles. Defeating him completes the player's transformation from rookie trainer to league champion, resolving the narrative arc that drove the entire journey. The Hall of Fame sequence, where the player's team is recorded after defeating the champion, creates a permanent record of the exact team composition that won the championship. These preserved teams become time capsules, allowing players to remember which Pokémon accompanied them to victory even years later. The ceremony transforms the player's team from tools for progression into honored partners, acknowledging the bond between trainer and Pokémon that defines the series' core themes. The game treats this moment with appropriate reverence, using music and pacing to create weight and significance that elevates victory beyond simple completion. Post-game content in Generation 1 remains minimal compared to later titles, with Cerulean Cave representing the primary challenge after becoming champion. This restriction creates a sense that catching Mewtwo caps the progression curve, as no battles or areas beyond this final legendary remain unexplored. Players who complete the Pokédex find themselves with little to do except restart with new teams or begin battling other players through link cable connections. This limited endgame contributed to the social aspects of Generation 1, as without extensive single-player post-game content, players naturally gravitated toward competitive battling and trading as ways to continue engaging with the games. The journey through Generation 1's obscure secrets reveals a game far more complex than its simple exterior suggests. What appeared to be a straightforward adventure for children contains layers of hidden mechanics, exploitable glitches, and emergent behaviors that have sustained dedicated communities for decades. These secrets transformed Pokémon from mere entertainment into subjects of serious study, with players investing thousands of hours understanding systems that developers expected would go largely unnoticed. The depth beneath simplicity explains why Generation 1 remains culturally relevant nearly 30 years after release, its secrets still yielding new discoveries as communities continue pushing boundaries and exploring possibilities. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.